Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Corbin, and I'm the coordinator for the Nova Scotia Coalition for Healthy School Food. My position is housed within Nourish, Nova Scotia, and I'm here to welcome you to the Building Successful School Cafeterias webinar. Nourish Executive Director Lisa Roberts will host a conversation with Chaiti Seth, lecturer in the community development at Acadia University, to discover what Nova Scotia can learn from Acadia's experience navigating third-party food service provider relationships and visioning their food service needs. This webinar is co-organized by the Nova Scotia Coalition for Healthy School Food and Nourish Nova Scotia, and a recording of this webinar will be available on Nourish's YouTube channel. If you do have questions, please use the chat box and we will have some time for questions at the end. And I want to start off with land acknowledgement. So I want to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We have folks joining us from across these lands, from Unama'ki to Gaspewitjik, a territory covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties. And if you are here as a settler today, as I am, I encourage you to take the time to consider how we have benefited from living and working in these unsurrendered lands and the commitments you'd like to make in centering Indigenous food sovereignty and other aspects of truth and reconciliation in your school food work. All right, and next up, I'm going to introduce Lisa and Chaiti. So Chaiti Seth is a mother, farmer, researcher, and experiential educator from India, currently living in Mi'kma'ki or Nova Scotia. She is a faculty member with the Department of Community Development at Acadia University, where she learns, writes, and teaches about sustainable food systems and the inner work and community practice of healing for equity and social change. Lisa Roberts is the executive director at Nourish, with previous experience as a nonprofit executive director and a master's in development economics. Lisa has promoted local food as a journalist, a community organizer, and as an MLA representing Halifax Needham. And I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks to everyone who has joined us today. But most especially to Chaiti, who I have had the pleasure of listening to and learning from in a couple of different occasions, and each time it's really been insightful and enjoyable. So I'm really glad to share that experience with folks through this webinar and with the collaboration from the Coalition for Healthy School Food nationally, which has supported us in getting this webinar out to folks. I see that note from Nancy Trigano. I will do my best. It's actually my microphone is close to my face, but I will maybe I'll just speak up and project a little bit. So the consultation has largely concluded, but lobbying continues right now for a federal investment in a pan-Canadian school food policy. In Nova Scotia, there's a focus not just on the budget for school food, but also on what is being served now in schools that have cafeterias. Not all schools do have cafeterias, but for those that do, many, most in fact, are run by third parties, typically private companies that have responded to requests for proposals. And according to a September report by the Auditor General of Nova Scotia, third-party service providers that operate more than half of the province's school cafeterias, only 9 of them tested actually were in compliance with the current policy around the food that's appropriate and healthy for school environments. So only 9% of those tested kind of met the mark. But at Acadia University, a different division of one of the same companies that operates many, many school cafeterias in Nova Scotia, is actually hitting a range of performance standards related to health, local ingredients, and sustainability. So that is why we have turned to Chaiti Seth today. As Lindsay mentioned, she is a lecturer in community development at Acadia, and she actually helped to set the goals and to build a constructive relationship with Acadia's food service provider. So I'm so pleased that Chaiti has agreed to share some lessons and suggestions for the P-12 education system in Nova Scotia, and indeed beyond. I think many lessons can be adapted and adopted no matter where people are joining us from today. So Chaiti, it's really nice to see you.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I would love if you could begin by sharing the origins of your interest in food in school settings.
So I'm one, as Lindsay said in my introduction, I'm a farmer amongst many other roles, and I've been farming for close to 20 years now. And so I've always had an interest in food, but my interest in food in school settings in particular predates my move to Mi'kma'ki. And before moving here, I worked in a school, a small community-based school that's also P-12, P-13, that's based in southern India, outside Bengaluru, called Center for Learning. And I had this really kind of dream job, or dream role over there, where I was a part-time teacher and part-time farmer. And that role really came from the fact that food and farming was quite integrated into the curriculum. So that was one of my roles there. And the way that we had obviously done our own kitchen, and food was simple. It still is. I'm no longer involved, but it's simple, it's seasonal, it's nourishing. And there's really a focus on not having any waste generated, and students are really involved in all of the pieces. So on the farm, in cooking and cleaning and prepping food, and then obviously in sharing meals. And that's a regular thing. It's not, it's kind of a one-off. They come into the kitchen. There's like 45 minutes of community work every morning as the start of the school day. And that includes working on the farm and the kitchen. And so even though the infrastructure and the landscape and the cultural setting was very different, I really look back to that as being foundational to the values I hold and the vision I hold around that school food can look like this, right? It can be simple, seasonal, nourishing, locally sourced, with very little waste generated, and where there's a lot of relationships that are really present in the food. So yeah, and also just to say that I think my vision and my work in food systems comes from that place of having my hands in the soil and in the mixing bowl. Yeah.
I love that. So where were things at Acadia in terms of their food when you arrived in Wolfville?
So the Acadia was as we are now with a third-party provider. There were several folks at Acadia who were working to shift the food system at the time. And I think one of the things in my understanding is that work has always been collective at Acadia, and I think that's an important piece. And so there were faculty in departments such as nutrition, environment and sustainability studies, community development. So where people were really familiar with and understanding the impacts of food systems on the community, on the local economics, on the land, in terms of sustainability, in terms of health, because of their research and educational work in their specific fields. And there were folks in student services who were concerned with, the health impacts and the social impacts, student satisfaction with relation to food service. And then eventually we got a sustainability coordinator at Acadia, and so obviously food was part of their portfolio as having a lot of impacts in that area as well. And so there were a number of people who were kind of involved in the work from these different positions. But obviously the task of changing food systems requires a lot of time and energy. And since for most people, this wasn't their direct job, it was kind of, something they were doing in addition, it was hard to find the time and the resources and the capacity to do this work. And so in 2015, a few folks applied for a grant from Thrive, and I was hired through that to start some of this work. And at the time, what I really began to do was look closely at the procurement data. And what had happened by 2015 was that there had already been a number of consultations, primarily with students, but also with faculty and staff, to try and understand what the issues were and also what people were looking for. So what was it that, what was not working and what would people like to see? So we had that as kind of a foundational basis. And then my role when I stepped in was really to start looking and digging into the procurement data to understand what's possible and what are the kind of areas where there's potential for change, but also to really understand what the obstacles were. Why is it so hard? And why do we get stuck in these particular places with larger institutional systems? And as I started to do the work, it became very clear that this wasn't, something that was going to end in a 9-month contract, that this was really like a bigger question and ongoing work. And so eventually I went on to do my master's research to understand what are these factors and processes of change, and what can we learn that we can do this with, that we can then share with other institutions, because obviously this change needs to happen in multiple levels for the bigger food system shifts to happen. And so the group of people that were doing this work continue to grow and evolve. Our current form is that we're a formal committee now. We're called the Acadia Food Services Advisory Committee, which has representation from students, from faculty, from staff, and we report to a senior administrator. We have had the food service provider on this committee before, but they're no longer, and we may get to that as part of the conversation around the rationale for that. But that's kind of how the work's evolved over time.
And I know that you have certain kind of benchmarks that are based on values. And so can you maybe name some of those, like when you're looking at for improvement in the food that is served to students and to faculty, what are the criteria or the buckets of improvement that you agreed to look for in that negotiation?
So what I'll do, and what might be helpful is I'm just going to throw the slides back up here for a minute so we can look at some of those targets. And I'll start with this first. You can see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So one of the things that we've done as a committee is create a food plan, which is really taking the opportunity to articulate our vision for food services, right? What is it that often we know what the issues are, but we've really come to see through the experience, and that's what my research was pointing to as well, that having a vision of like, what is it we want to work towards, right? Because we know this is going to be hard work, we know it's going to require persistence, we know it's going to have a whole bunch of obstacles that come up. And so we kind of need that shared vision, or having a sense of what it is we're moving towards, not just what we're moving away from, is really critical. And so part of the process of coming to the targets, or like the buckets, was us articulating what are all the pieces of this vision. And that meant including the voices of all the different stakeholders, particularly the ones that tend to get left out. And here's kind of what we've landed on. So our food plan has these 9 areas: health, sustainability, affordability, accessibility, which is kind of distinguishing from the financial accessibility of affordability to also time, culturally, if you have different diets, is food accessible, and so on. Community, education, engagement, service excellence, and accountability between the food service provider and the institution, as well as between the institution and the eaters. So that's kind of what we landed on. And then based on that, we set a number of targets. So the reason that, because it has all of these different dimensions of food, our targets it's not just one target, it's often, there's a series of targets that cover these areas. I just pulled a few here. This isn't the whole list. But for example, when I first started doing the work and I first started, we didn't know, we were like, where are we starting? Well, we don't know. And so it took kind of digging into the procurement data to get to that number. We were under 10% at the time. By the time we got to the current contract that we're in, we were at 20%. And so our target for local procurement, which is the total dollar amount of our budget that's spent on food going towards local producers or processors, is 20% minimum, increasing to 50% over the course of the contract. So that one out of every $2, $1 goes back, should be going back locally. Sustainably produced, and we have criteria for what we define that. 10% increasing to 20%, animal welfare certified, 20% increasing to 50%, sustainable seafood, 20% increasing to 50% MSC, and I might come back to this in that we've shifted this target now, and then plant-based options as 20% of the menu. Yeah, so those are some examples of the kind of targets that we set.
And I know, because I've had the chance to listen to you on a couple of other occasions, that sometimes different targets can reinforce each other. So for example, the plant-based options helps also with accessibility or financial, like affordability of food, because plant-based foods tend to be less expensive.
Absolutely. And so in general, we've tried, and this is where I would say we've really taken a systems approach, and where I would really, one of my learnings coming out of it is just how important it is to look at all of these different dimensions of food, and look at them together, right? Sometimes there's a temptation to be like, oh, we can't follow, we can't pursue all of these things at once. It's going to be too much. But our learning is actually that the more layered we make it, we're able to make progress on multiple things by actually starting to see how we can pull them together. And so absolutely, our encouragement to the food service provider was, when they submitted request bids in response to our request for proposal, we really encouraged them to say, can you meet multiple targets at once? Can you tell us, what are your strategies for meeting multiple things that we're asking for? And absolutely, plant-based is one of those that we had put out to them as saying, obviously we know with animal foods, there's like abundant evidence that meat consumption has environmental impacts, whether it's in relation to water use, fossil fuel use, land usage, and more. From our consultations with students at Acadia, they really cared about animal welfare. That's something that came up a lot, that they wanted to know where the meat was sourced from and how the animals were being treated. And we, when we're talking about sometimes, not always, and I think this is quite, this is a myth we have to keep working on, is that local food isn't always expensive. It depends on what it is and when you're sourcing it and so on. But sometimes with local producers, especially with ones who are using more sustainable practices, there may be a higher cost in that some of those costs are internalized, and they're actually looking after some of those costs that are usually externalized. But that because plant-based is cheaper, and I always laugh, I'm like, you can buy the most locally produced or certified organic black beans, and they will be cheaper than the cheapest cut of beef you can buy, right? And so what it does is that it actually creates enough room in the budget for us to invest in some other places as well. So because it has all of these multiple impacts, we really look for how do these targets overlap and what are the really strategic ways in which we can make shifts. Yeah.
So when I actually don't know Acadia well enough to know how many different spaces the company is providing food services in, but when you walk into one of those spaces, a cafeteria, what difference do you see?
Mm-hmm. So there's a number of changes, and I did want to respond to this question by saying, there's so much more that can be done. And I think that we're really in progress. And the last couple of years of the pandemic have definitely been a bit of a roller coaster, and that, multiple things were like, oh, we can't focus on this now because we're responding to these other things. But there are changes that have been made. And so one is seeing more plant-based options being offered. The other part of it is really normalizing it. And so in the past, plant-based options have often been like here's a vegetarian station, or here's a vegan station, and it's kind of off on the side, and it has, one or two things that are offered. But part of the idea with the plant-based is to really integrate it with the offerings that are being made, so that it's seen as a very regular option. It's seen as a desirable option. It's seen as an option that anyone can make. You don't necessarily have to identify with a particular diet. But I would also say that, a number of the things that are happening are actually behind the scenes. And so you may not notice them when you walk in to the cafeteria. But definitely there's been a real shift in our local food spend. So we're now up to 30% at this point. And this was enabled because one was all of the kind of the process and the time that went into creating a food plan so that we have a clear vision. And what that enabled was that when we went into the last request for proposal process that led to the current RFP, we were actually able to advocate with senior administration to use that food plan as the basis for the RFP. And so that enabled us to have these targets in the contract itself, where there's some accountability towards it. The other piece of it is that, we can have this vision of we want local foods, we want more plant-based foods, we want to buy more, more sustainably produced food. But some of the obstacles that we run into are really systemic and structural. And that's where I think actually our learning at Acadia is transferable, in that when we're working with external companies, we're running into the same systemic barriers, we're running into the same policy barriers. And so a couple of things that I'll just highlight that are, again, they're a little bit back of the scene. But one of the reasons we found, one of the obstructions we ran into when we were trying to increase our local procurement, being in an area where we have, it's like a really rich agricultural area, right? We have access to food in ways that not everybody does. And yet at the same time, we weren't able to increase those percentages. And part of that was that the way that the procurement process is set up assumes buying from a large broad scale distributor like Cisco, right? It assumes a certain structure that you interact with. And so one of the things that we put into our requests for proposal was that the food service provider had to create channels that would allow us to buy from smaller scale local producers. And so there are things in, one of them is the buy local channel, and what some of the requirements in there are shorter payment cycles. So we recognize that small producers can't wait 6 months before they get paid the way that you can do with a broadline supplier. The insurance requirements that are often made from really large scale producers aren't applicable or are too burdensome for smaller scale producers. The quality assurance processes, not that they're not in place, but again, the scale of them isn't the same as what a large producer could have. And so the buy local channel is really a separate procurement process that still meets the health and safety requirements of the food service provider and the institution, but allows us to access smaller producers. So that's one thing that's gone into place. The other one, and I can see whether it makes time to get into this now, is that it took us again, we have a lot of small producers in Nova Scotia who are producing good quality meat with much better animal welfare standards. We have grass-fed animals being raised locally, but we weren't able to access it because very few Nova Scotia producers had federal inspection. And at the time, our food service provider had an internal policy. This was not an Acadia institutional policy, but a food service provider policy that they could only buy federally inspected meat. And the reason at the time given was that it was a safety issue. And so, this is the kind of thing you do behind the scenes, is that I sat and read the 50 pages of the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the 50 pages of the Provincial Meat Inspection Act. And I talked to the various meat inspectors to recognize that Nova Scotia actually has really stringent meat inspection regulations. And so that we're not, it's not a compromise on safety to be serving that meat. But it took several years for us to be able to work with the food service provider to allow for provincially inspected meat to be included. But that now means that we can access locally produced meat that is, sometimes in some cases much more sustainably produced with better animal welfare standards, and that we have the possibility of having a relationship with the producer and recognizing. So those are some of the things that are happening on the back end that affect the quality of the ingredients and what's being served. Yeah.
So, our particular interest is how can the P-12 education system in Nova Scotia benefit from your learnings and your work. And it strikes me that a really tangible way is that, some of those changes to internal government, internal company policy ought to be, I don't know if leverageable is a word, but other entities who also want to procure locally, who also, want to be able to buy from smaller producers, ought to be able to use those same mechanisms. Do you have, I guess, advice on how we share that knowledge so that people understand that it's an option?
Yeah. I think what we're doing here is one is one thing, right? And I think it really is that, in that, and that's where I come back to vision as such a key piece, and that, it's not going to necessarily be driven by the food service provider, right? It has to be driven by the institution. But what we can do as institutions or, individuals or communities working on this together is network and collaborate. And so, yes, absolutely. I don't know what the internal mechanisms are of how, a school, P-12 school versus a post-secondary division within the same company might be different, but these are company level policies. And so one of the reasons we're often given is we can't make this change because it's not just about your institution. We actually have to change it for every single account that we have. It has to become possible. Well, that's both a barrier, but once that is shifted, it's now should be accessible to every institute, right? It should be accessible to all of the people who have accounts with that organization. But sometimes it takes knowing that that's something that's possible to go ask some questions, right? You won't necessarily see a buy local channel advertised. But when you go and start asking questions, well, it exists over there. And so then what does that mean when we start to collectively look at those options?
Yes. I want to talk about fair wages. So right now in Nova Scotia, in cafeterias, like I've gone and looked at job ads and for cafeteria workers, and some of those cafeteria workers will be getting an increase when the minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour because they're making significantly less than that at the moment. Were wages and like support for cafeteria staff a part of your whole process?
Yes, in the sense that we considered it, and no, in the sense that I don't think we made a lot of progress on it, or we haven't made progress on it. And that's, again, this is where having multiple people and multiple stakeholders involved is so important. And I think one of the gaps in our committee or in our group is someone who's really doing that work, who has kind of a background, whether it's in terms of research or engagement, to bring that expertise on what's possible. And so I think that's absolutely a gap that we need to do more on. At the same time, I think there are really excellent examples. Food Share in Toronto is an organization I really look to for the work that they're doing that's exemplary and innovative around food justice, and that includes fair wages, dignified working conditions, benefits, and so on for food workers. And so there are examples, and I know that there's examples within here in Mi'kma'ki in Nova Scotia of schools that are, including in the Valley, of schools that are doing things like bringing in benefits, paid snow days, and so on. So I know that there's work that's happening. I don't think that I don't have a lot to offer. I don't think that's one that we've made enough progress on.
Fair. Are there other ways that you can think of or you would want to name about how the post-secondary context is different than the P to 12 context? I mean, snow days and even summer holidays are maybe relevant, though not necessarily. It's not necessarily that different, but there are differences. So why don't we kind of name some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think is different, and part of it is just my lack of knowledge around what the specifics of kitchens across, I know the ones that I'm familiar with, but what do kitchen setups across the province for school, P to 12 schools look like? And I imagine that it varies, that the infrastructure varies. And I do know that the infrastructure is kind of key. And so one of the advantages that we had at Acadia, which not all universities have, or not all post-secondary institutions have, is that we still had a functional kitchen that allowed for scratch cooking, or, really starting with ingredients and whole foods. And it wasn't just like a heat, they were just reheating and serving. And so that, if that's what infrastructure is available, well, that really dictates what's going to be possible in terms of your vision, right? So I think that's something that we have to consider, like what's available. I think affordability is always a question. Budgets are already, the amount that's available to spend on ingredients and to pay people, which again, as I said, is one we haven't touched as much, is always small, but post-secondary meal plans tend to be expensive. And my understanding is that it's still a little bit more wiggle room than there is available in the school. Now, I do think that there's advantages in a school, in a school setting that are different than ours as well. And so one of the things that we've struggled with in the post-secondary context is that there is this, what I really call the illusion of choice, right? But there is this assumption that there will be multiple stations with, when we were looking at the request for proposal bids that came in from the different companies, I counted them up, and one of the companies had offered 53 different options of food in one meal, right? There were like 53 different things you could choose from, but it was like a salad bar, a sandwich, but there is this kind of the norm, the convention, which is then what things get based on, is that there has to be all of these different options available. Whereas, if I go back to kind of my vision from Center for Learning, one of the things that I think really enabled us to have the quality of food that we had was that we weren't trying to offer this. And again, because it's all made from really very few industrialized ingredients, it's just an illusion of choice, but it complicates things, right? And so the idea of having like one option or a couple of options available for a school meal, the fact that people sit down and share that meal together as opposed to coming in and kind of eating on your own schedule, I think those are real advantages in a P to 12 setting. I think, and this is my, not my lens as a researcher, but maybe my hat as a parent, is I think we could have more time for eating food and really recognizing the educational potential for food in school settings, so that we can take some time to kind of unpack and build that relationship. But just recognizing that in the P to 12 context, we have young eaters. And we have, and so there is this, as opposed to when students are coming into post-secondary, where many might have much more formed food habits, this is really when a relationship with food is developing. And so I think there's so much potential and scope there to build meaningful and nurturing and kind of reciprocal relationships with food at that time. Yeah, is there anything else in terms of?
Well, maybe one thing that I'll bring us to is universality, like the best practice, very clear, research-backed best practice for school food programs, particularly if you're concerned about the impact for learners who may be arriving at school hungry, is that you want to be making meals truly inviting for everyone, that you want universal access, but you even want to be moving towards universal participation if you're really concerned about the student who will choose not to eat because of stigma in a meal program that doesn't strive for that. So what impact would striving for universality have on the procurement process? Or what thoughts does that bring to you, again, about those differences?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the advantages of universality is that I'm assuming it increases the volumes of procurement overall, right? And one of the things that we can, again, there's so many things that are challenging in terms of having these really large centralized systems. One of the advantages is that those systems respond well to larger volumes. And so if we have a pretty big volume that we're asking for, it might be enough incentive for a producer to then meet that volume, right? And so it's like, oh yeah, we could provide it in this different form. We could mash the potatoes because there's enough of a volume that's required. And so I think the increased volume allows for some leverage, whether it's in terms of the way the product shows up, being able to source that product, and so on. But also with the company, for example, saying developing different recipes, because you now have multiple accounts where you can use that, or putting in the resources to test out different foods and then having them accessible in multiple accounts. And so I think the volume can be a leverage point if it's used in that way. And then I think it really does, I do think it comes back to, obviously with universality, we have to think about cost as well. And I think that's where really using those strategic leverage points, I think plant-based foods is such an important piece of the puzzle. I can't emphasize it enough, in the sense that I think it really allows us to meet multiple targets. We know the health benefits that are associated with it. And so I think really thinking strategically about what will allow us to offer foods that are nourishing and exciting and at the same time are affordable, I think will be one of the, when we think about universality, that's one of the pieces. And I think that's where we can really draw on what's already happening in individual schools through parent or community participation, where there are models of, children trying new foods and creating community around food, and what's happening that we can learn from.
Well, I've seen a couple of questions pop into the chat, so I'm going to ask a kind of another big one, and then maybe we'll turn our attention to those questions. But given that more than half of the school cafeterias in Nova Scotia are under contract with third-party providers, and actually predominantly with Chartwells, which is the same company that provides the food service at Acadia, what can we learn about the relationship, about like holding that relationship and working in that relationship?
Yeah, that's I think it's a great question. Oh, 1 second here. Yeah, so these were a few of the things that I pulled up, but I do think that contracts are pretty critical. And when, in this kind of relationship, because it is a relationship between an institution and another institution. And so I think having those things written down, having really clear performance areas, like what are our focus areas, what are the things we want to make shifts around, and then how do we know, and what are kind of reasonable targets for us to meet is important. Obviously, in order to have that, you need the institutional vision. I feel like we've talked about that a lot. I would really emphasize the procurement data. It's really hard to make shifts without knowing what our baseline is. And I think putting in the work to really understand what is the picture. When I first started asking questions, oftentimes we didn't know where things were coming from. It took a while to say, well, can you actually fill in if we want to move towards local, well, we don't even know where things are coming from right now, right? Like what's our percentage? If we want to track different certifications, whether it's around seafood or around animal welfare, we need to know what the current picture is and what's possible. And so I think really engaging with the procurement data is pretty important for the relationship with the food service provider. And then I think organizational capacity is a big one. And I would say this continues to be an ongoing challenge at Acadia. We've had people who've had more capacity at different times through research projects or through contracts. And when that wanes, then our capacity to kind of keep the relationship accountable also ebbs and flows. And so one of the things that was in our last contract was that we asked for additional organizational capacity from the food service provider. So we asked for them to create a position. We had actually asked for one that was focused on nutrition and one focused on sustainability. We ended up getting a joint position, which isn't ideal, but it's definitely a start. In that, there's when we have a question or we need the numbers crunched, there's actually someone whose job it is to do that, and so we can go to them and say, can you find this out? Can you track this? Can you tell us what the numbers are? Can you follow up with this producer? And there's organizational capacity, because that really tends to be a place where things stop. But I would equally emphasize, and I think this is ongoing work at Acadia, that we need organizational capacity on the other side, for the school or the university or the college, for this to be someone's job, just to recognize that it takes work, that food takes work, and serving this kind of food takes work. And so we need someone who's able to put in the time and have that kind of knowledge and continuity of knowledge in order to keep these relationships accountable, really moving towards, because it's quite easy for inertia and kind of whatever's been happening for a long time to take over.
And, I would definitely say from conversations I've had with folks at the level of engaging in those conversations with third-party providers at different RCEs, that it would be awesome if there was a person holding folks accountable at a provincial level, because I've definitely heard, someone over here say, oh, I had that conversation that you're having now about this not meeting, the standards that you've agreed to currently, the school food and nutrition, policy. That we had that conversation last year, and now somebody in a different region is having that conversation again. And that means that there's a lot of demands at the RCE level that isn't actually really shouldn't be necessary. Yeah.
And absolutely underlying this, if I can add one more thing, is that, provincial level policies would be amazing, right? So if we had actually policies in place at the provincial level, which with what used to be EXPA, we had it wasn't a policy, it wasn't a requirement, but kind of the 20% spend on local gave, that's where we started from with that 20% target at Acadia way back. We've since moved up, but that gave us something to work with. And so having, for example, provincial level policies that say we have to, as institutions that are we're community institutions, we're involved with the public, we're serving the communities, what is our responsibility to also be investing back in communities and in community food security. And so I think just there's a role for provincial level policies that could really support this work by being a foundation for institutions. Just as we have a policy on what kinds of foods can be served, right, in terms of healthy foods. Yeah.
Well, some folks on this call are part of those conversations, so I'm sure that what you just said is, encouraging to them. So I'm going to turn to one of the questions in the chat, which is around that provincially inspected meat question. And definitely, at one point, I was the agriculture critic when I was an MLA, and the challenge around provincial inspection is a real significant challenge for a lot of smaller producers. So the question is, are you able to source provincially inspected meats from your large-scale distributor, or are you purchasing these direct?
They've mostly been purchasing, I will qualify that by saying that I haven't looked at the procurement data very recently, but when that program started, we were purchasing mostly directly from producers. But I don't think, for us, the holdup was not whether our broadline distributor could access them, because they could. It was an internal policy of the corporate food service provider that they were not able to serve that meat. And it's interesting because at Acadia, we have, most of it is run by the corporate food service provider, but we do have a couple of locations that are independent. And they were serving that meat, right? So there's also this, it's not as though we weren't serving provincially inspected meat on campus before this shift happened. But for the most part, we've been working directly with producers, with smaller scale producers, which is also for multiple reasons, because it's also then enabled us to access, for example, and again, this is something that's not happening currently, but for many years we were able to buy grass-fed beef, for example, which, in terms of animal welfare standards, sustainability standards, also met more criteria.
Another question, and I'd be glad if you also riffed off of this one from your perspective as a mom now with a kid in public school. But the question was, what has Acadia been able to do to respect or honor cultural differences in their food services?
Mm-hmm. I would say that we have a long ways to go. I think there are efforts, but often efforts around different cuisines and cultures tend to get fairly localized around like a particular day that we serve food, or a particular, it's like, oh, it's this month, or it's this festival, or and I think there's really a lot of room for it to be broadened. I think there is one of the things that's also been part of the process is setting up mechanisms for students to give more direct feedback. And so, in the service excellence portion, there is a piece where, like, how is the feedback that students are giving being addressed in real time, or is it just kind of disappearing into a black hole? And so I think that's something that in real time students are giving feedback on. When there is a meal that they like, or a meal that feels familiar, they're able to give that feedback of like, oh, we'd like to see more of this. When is this coming back? And so I think there's, at that level, on a more kind of immediate day-to-day level, there's slightly better mechanisms for feedback and for students to have more input. But I would say, by and large, my understanding, at least from my perspective, is that there's a lot of room for us to shift that. And particularly as we start to talk about, for example, plant-based meals, the recognition that for a lot of cultures, including the one that I come from, we have a long history and really a wide, like, plant-based foods is something we've done for a few thousand years, right? And so that we have the potential to really, as we want to make shifts, to really draw on the kind of cuisines, and with recognition and acknowledgement and honoring where that comes from, but that the ways of eating and the kind of food that we would like to serve, that's been done in other places, and so we can really look to that and incorporate that.
And that it's tasty and not necessarily super spicy, and like people have sometimes assumptions or guesses at what students' reaction will be to those meals that aren't necessarily grounded in the actual experience.
No, and I would say that as a parent, I'll speak in there, but I really feel like, yeah, we can have a lot of, culturally, we can hold a lot of notions around, whether children are open or not, or children are willing to try things, or it's too spicy, but, yeah, I think that there's a lot of educational potential there around what we expose our children to, what we normalize, what we celebrate, what we enjoy, and how that kind of really makes room for people to have much wider palates, to enjoy different kinds of food. And that also enables it, right? Because one of the things I think we haven't named is kind of maybe a fear that people hold, or that the feedback they get on a day-to-day basis is like, oh, even if we make all these shifts, people won't eat them, right? Our food service provider will often say to us, and I think that we're still in the midst of that battle of like, oh, we can move to, we moved to plant-based, but there was pushback because people want to eat meat. Well, those are cultural shifts. It takes time to shift culture. And so we really have to hold that as a long-term goal in order to make those shifts. But I can certainly attest that children eat spicy food and all kinds of, we have battles over Brussels sprouts in my household regularly. And my 2-year-old's second food was homemade baba ganoush with raw garlic and chili peppers. So I think there's like all the versions of what can open up.
Yeah, I still have a very clear memory of my I think 1-year-old or 1.5-year-old grabbing her first samosa that I thought was really spicy, and just like, finishing it and asking for the next one. Another question: to what extent is wholesale purchasing and distribution a barrier in purchasing local? So less the food service provider, the folks in the cafeteria, but the folks that are supplying them the food.
So like what infrastructure is available on that end?
And wholesale, to what extent is wholesale purchasing and distribution a barrier in purchasing local? So what I'm picturing is, the truck that pulls up to the back of the kitchen, what if they can't get the local because of their distribution channels?
So a couple of things. That's such a great question. One is, I think that that's actually a leverage point, in that sometimes, we talk about contracts, and one of the other things that isn't spoken about very often is that the corporations are also in contracts with the distributors, right? And so there's actually restrictions, and these are not often on the table. It took a lot of digging for us to get to those, that there are restrictions around what they can buy. And so distinguishing, for example, local spinach from spinach then gives us leverage to say, well, if the wholesale provider or if the distributor can't actually access that, then we can go somewhere else to look for it because it's a product they can't provide, right? And so if we're tied into a contract that says we have to purchase from this distributor, well, if they can't access the product that we want, then we have to go elsewhere. So one is that actually creates a little bit of space, or it might create incentive for the distributor to then go find someone who can supply with local spinach. But it means thinking about spinach and local spinach as two different products, right? It's us distinguishing, like, oh, spinach isn't just spinach no matter where it comes from, which is generally how a catalog looks at it, but saying that we're seeing a product that's being locally produced or processed as different than a product that's coming from somewhere else. So that's actually can be a leverage point. Again, not one that someone will come and speak to you about, but you can ask, we can ask questions and dig in. The other piece is absolutely that I think there's room for infrastructure, and we're seeing that happening. I know there's at the moment consultations happening for a food hub in the HRM region, the Wolfville Farmers Market, and I've been involved with some of that work as well, is working towards a food hub. Kelly Marie at the Wolfville Farmers Market and I actually had this conversation back in 2016, I think, when I first started this work. And I was like, we need, like, one of the things they're saying is we need large volumes and we need a consistent supply. And it's difficult for us. And this is an understandable thing, right? For someone in an institutional kitchen to say, well, I can't actually go to 5 different producers and ask if something's available. I have to plan my menu for the month, da, 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 da. And so that there is absolutely, I think, a role for mid-level processors and distributors. And that's also bringing another piece of the puzzle into the local food infrastructure and local food economy, right? So that we now have processors locally, we have distributors locally, and all of that kind of money and the jobs are also then staying in the community. So I think there's absolutely a role, and that we need to, and it's really exciting that this is coming from in multiple places, although of course it has its barriers as well for aggregating local product and processing local product in ways that might be really beneficial.
Yeah, and I'm part of some of those conversations too, and it's quite exciting to see the potential and see some of the potential get realized. And I think of, even the work that the Station Food Hub has done, with smaller potatoes that are now ending up in long-term care facilities that otherwise might have not been produced. And I know that, many people envision what to do with all the cauliflower that, or the smaller sweet potatoes or the larger cauliflower. There's so much that can be done if we connect that food with where there is need for food, particularly in public institutions. There's a question from Anne. Do you have a measure of the portion of food that goes unconsumed or otherwise is considered waste? Are there specific strategies your provider uses to reduce the cost and quantity of waste?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't have a figure off the top of my head, although it is one that we could access because it is now part of the reporting that they have to. So the food service provider is now required to report on that waste. That's actually interestingly one of the things where, and again, this is where they can leverage, the corporate scale. And so our food service provider has access to specific technology, to specific infrastructure where they can weigh the food that comes back after every meal. And obviously for them, there's a financial incentive to reduce the amount of waste, right? And so it's one that they picked up on fairly quickly. And so they have internal training for their staff to watch, what are the items that are coming back? What is it that people tend to serve themselves, but then not finish eating? And so they have machinery that kind of weighs it. It tells them the dollar value based on their recipes of how much food was not consumed. And so those figures are available. But I think one of the ways that they address that is to really make shifts in their menu based on the items that are popular that tend to get eaten or not. One of the pieces that's been, and again, this is different than school food settings, and this was done quite a long time ago at Acadia. There was a lot of research around just knowing that if you have trays available in the cafeteria, well, people serve a lot of food and a lot of it goes to waste. And if you take the trays away, you're not reducing people's access to food. It just means they have to walk back and get a second plate if they need one, but the amount of waste goes down dramatically. So there are often food environment, like how do we set up the environment that allows for food waste or not? And then the other portion on the menu, that we are encouraging on the menu, kind of on the committee end, is offering fewer options, right? And so the more options there are, the more prep you have to do for multiple things, the more options you're putting out, the more food there is that may not get consumed because you don't know what people are going to choose. And so having sort of more like, here's the meal that's being served, and then we're making fewer things, but we can make them with higher quality ingredients. We can make them with, we can start from scratch or put more work into them because we're offering fewer options. So that's another kind of strategy in terms of reducing waste that we've used. And then I think the final one is just really making sure that it's composted, and so that I believe now that it's set up, have a composter on site that allows that to be turned into compost. And then that can be made available for like a community farm or in Acadia's case, we actually have a community farm on campus, but that it could be made available for a school garden or for another purpose, but just making sure that it's separated out well and then composted.
We're getting close to the end of our time. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you'd want to share related to food literacy and like student engagement in food, which is certainly one of the goals for us at Nourish as kind of a leader in the school food space, and it's also one of the guiding principles in the advocacy work of the Coalition for Healthy School Food, that universal school food programs should be both health promoting and promoting of food literacy. Anything that you can share on that?
Yeah, and obviously this isn't coming from my work at Acadia, but I really do think that contact as a farmer, as a parent, as an educator in the school setting, I think my experience, as well as, we know that the research is pretty clear on this as well, is that the more contact there is between food and people, the more that relationship is strengthened. And so I'll just share, anecdotally, again, an example from Center for Learning. The word in Hindi for eggplant is bengan. And, when we were farming and we arrived, like and I think might be the equivalent of Brussels sprouts here, but there's so much of like, oh, Bengal, ooh, like the moment you say the word, like, oh, you hear all these kids making all these noises and running away. And because that's the narrative, right? It's one of those foods that's like, oh, who wants to eat that food? And then we took seedlings, and students planted the seedlings out, and then they watered them and they weeded them and they looked after them and they watched the eggplants grow. And then when we harvest the eggplant, there is, and I'm not suggesting that there's like some romantic version of like, they all wanted to eat the eggplant after that, but it's a very different relationship. The willingness to try, the openness to really enjoying it is something is quite dramatically different. And so I do think that the more contact time we have, and again, I think that having enough time to eat, right? Like having enough time in our breaks for eating that we can actually not just like put the food in our mouth, but be able to tell the stories, be able to share some of the process, including time in the, whatever it looks like for students to be involved in growing food or in preparing food in school settings. I think that that's something that's invaluable. And we do know that the research is very clear that helps really shift the kind of relationships we have with food, because it's different than when something just shows up on your plate and your only role in that situation is to eat it. Well, you're going to have a very different response than if you're involved in different places and you have a sense of how much goes into it. So I would say like more points of contact, more time to celebrate food, more events. And I see that here in school, that often, I'm just curious about like what could, a little bit like maybe the Nourish food box, or like where is it that it could move beyond us having processed foods at events or processed foods for fundraisers to really having, using those opportunities to build more relationship with food, and for children and for us to see more of the story of food, right? And to talk about that and center that.
Thank you so much. A late question that came in that I'm actually surprised didn't come up earlier, so maybe you could address it just quickly. How are you defining local?
Yeah, so we just use, it's always a sticky question.
Yes.
In our case, we used so this. Let's see if I can get the full form. The Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, I believe, ASHI, is an organization that uses a measure of local that's 400 kilometers. Now, for our sake, based on where Acadia is and the size of this province, it kind of mapped pretty easily to being, Nova Scotia. And so we've used that, but we do have a nested definition. So it says Nova Scotia first, then Maritimes, and then Canadian, but we're really counting the province as local and using that as the kind of first measure, because that felt like a contained amount, but it also, being a post-secondary education, it kind of gelled with this broader framework that we were also kind of referring to.
Okay, thanks so much. Chaiti, I can't see all of your slides. Is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you would like to say in the last couple of minutes?
I can throw them back up here in a second. Look. Yeah, I don't think there's, I'll just throw these up for a second because we're here. But yeah, I don't think there's much that we haven't touched on. This idea of building facilitation skills and having, collaborative leadership. So having more than one, often we have like a champion in a particular setting who can really carry the work. And I think that's phenomenal. It's amazing what people can do. And I think the more that we bring, one of the things we've noted at Acadia is that even when somebody's retired or someone's gone on leave, that it can really shift, right, how our ability to keep that work going, so that the more people in some ways that we can pull in, the more stability it gives to our work. Now it does lead, I'm quite a hands-on person and I'm a doer, and I've definitely sat in meetings where I'm like, we're still talking, we're still talking about what our vision is. But in hindsight, I do see, and my research also really pointed to the fact that all of those conversations of us building a shared understanding means that there are a lot more people to hold the vision, right? There's a lot more people who are asking questions. There are a lot more people who are watching around campus to see what's going on. So I think that piece is pretty important. Yeah, and I will highlight this one. I just think, similar to what I was saying about the fact that there are, that our food service, the corporations sign contracts with distributors and they're tied into those things. Our institutions sign contracts with the food service providers and they're tied into things, and that those are often really binding agreements that aren't spoken of when we come down to the table. And so I think really digging for and asking those questions of like, okay, what are the things that, is there a certain, it's called a kickback, like is there a certain amount that the food service provider is providing back to the institution at the end of the year? Well, what implications does that have? And that's something that's often not talked about. And so just the recognition that there are always capitalist structures and processes in place when we're working at this scale, and just kind of ask questions to try and dig out what those are, to know what the constraints are, is really helpful. And then finding ways to leverage, neutralize, or work around these. And then the other one, I think, is, just using the organizational and community assets that we have. And so in our case, often the things that we pursued were because we knew producers who could provide that, or we knew, we know the Woeful Farmers Market is working towards this. Well, what are the ways that we can set up things at Acadia so that we could eventually work with them, right? And so really keeping in mind, while this work is really centralized through the organization, there's still a lot of room to use local assets, I think. And so, not hesitating to align around that. Maybe those are the last two pieces I might add.
Listen, thank you so much. And we have had a question from someone asking if you plan to share the slides. We can connect about that to see if that's possible afterwards. Also, you've been very generous and shared previously with me your thesis. And someone commented back to me that they'd never enjoyed reading a thesis so much, that it was so accessible and even entertaining. So anyhow, so folks can certainly be in contact with Nourish if they're seeking more information, and we can do our best to facilitate that. But for everyone who joined, and especially to you, Chaiti, thank you very much for sharing some learning with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for listening. It's always, yeah, it's hard not to see your faces or know who's out there, but thank you for your time and attention. Very much appreciate it.
And please, for anyone who's tuned in and who isn't already subscribed to the Nourish Nova Scotia monthly newsletter, that's sort of our primary channel in addition to social media for letting you know about different learning opportunities. And we're already kind of dreaming and scheming about a couple upcoming webinar ideas. So I would really be grateful if you would go to our website or go to the link that was just shared in the chat to make sure that you don't miss that news. Thank you. We'll talk soon.